So Anna, why is the US important from that perspective? Why is US trade policy important from that perspective?
So the US is important in a lot of ways. First and most obvious one is that it's still the biggest economy by a range of measures. The other one is that it has the dollar, and the dollar is the reserve currency of choice pretty much the world over. And it's the currency of international trade. So if you trade commodities, if you're dealing with a range of different kind of financial contracts, you will normally price those in dollars. That means whatever happens to the dollar, which is within the control of the US Federal Reserve to an extent, and to an extent the US Treasury, that means that you've got a phenomenal sort of center of gravitational force over global trade. People will always say, you know, will other things overtake the dollar? Will the euro overtake the dollar? Will China's renminbi overtake the dollar? And really nothing has so far. And the death of the dollar is very much overstated. The other thing you have is that because it's one of the biggest economies in the world, it's also one of the biggest regulators in the world. So in the same way that people talk about the Brussels effect with Europe, saying that people pull it into their regulatory orbit, the US has also done a pretty good job of doing that in a lot of cases, in a lot of areas, particularly financial regulation. So there's a huge range of different reasons why the US is pretty important for us to pay attention to. It's also a huge military power. And while that doesn't necessarily feed through directly into commerce, it definitely feeds through into people's ability to say no to it when it has huge influence as a vast military power at a range of international institutions. So whether you're sort of OPEC, you're the group of oil trading nations that might determine the price of certain commodities, including oil, you aren't necessarily going to ignore what the US is doing or what it's advising or where it's placing itself in terms of geostrategic sensitivities. And lastly, because the US is a big decision maker when it comes to a lot of other countries' attitudes towards China because of military interlinks through NATO. So military alliances feed into trade alliances. So you see that in multiple ways, like, for instance, the US's view of the trade relationship between Germany and Russia. Germany doesn't just go and without any fuss build a pipeline with gas coming from Russia to Germany. It has to pay attention to the US response to that because of military alliances and other relationships like NATO. So there's a military might power, there's a dollar might power, and then there's a sort of the regulation and broader diplomacy might power. So there's kind of those three lenses through which to look at the US as this dominant force in global trade.